everyone, I'm Julia Usher from Recipes for a Sweet Life. Welcome back. Today I've got another of my Prettier Plaques cookie stencil sets to share with you. It's been particularly top of mind because I recently used it in a cookie decorating course. As an aside, I teach cookie decorating classes all over the world. I love to meet my fans in person, so please do try to join me at one of those. Links to my classes will be in the video description. In the meantime, I'm giving you a complete video version of that class. In that class, I showed how to use my 5 stencil set exactly as intended, just to lay the background with a message, etc. But I also then took it beyond that and gave it a really vintage look and antique feel by employing a number of different aging techniques, if you will, and also using a lot of different crafting tools and edible elements to give it relief and dimension, and as I said, a very vintage, antique look. We'll be doing all of that today. The great news about this cookie, while it might sound like it's got many elements, which it does, it moves pretty fast because stenciling is very fast, and it's super forgiving. If you put a little extra dust here or a little extra royal icing shard here, it doesn't matter. We're going for a vintage look, so a little bit of messiness is perfectly appropriate in this cookie. So let's talk about what we'll need for this project. First of all, you'll need one iced and partially dry cookie. I'm going to try to show you a fully cracked background. We're going to airbrush and fully crack it. So the icing just needs to be set on top but wet underneath. At least one cookie that's dry all the way through to show you my traditional stenciling approach. Of course, my Julia Usher Bon Voyage set. Let me pause here and tell you a little bit about the elements of that set. It's a 5-piece stencil set that's designed to create beautiful layered message plaque cookies. So this set, for instance, creates this cookie if you use it just as it is, and use the colors of brown and blue, of course. And to get that, you work with a background piece that looks like so, a masking piece which goes over the background to leave a space for your message, a frame to surround the message itself, in this case Bon Voyage. My class was a vintage travel theme, which is why this cookie fit perfectly into that class. And then lastly, though I apply this usually sooner in the process, is an optional shading piece that creates sort of a shadow around the message if you want to use that. And we'll be using probably all 5 pieces today. To keep those stencils in place while you're stenciling, you need an assortment of frames. The Stencil Genie by Creative Cookier keeps the background in place, and then I use an assortment of magnets mostly to weight down the small pieces. They don't need to be magnetized, you just need small weights. Sometimes bigger weights to weight down the corners of the genie, but not always. And as I said, we're going to go from these basics. This is sort of all you need to stencil the cookie, plus of course airbrush colorings and an airbrush. I'm coming out with a new airbrush, so we're going to see a prototype of it today. That's all you need to do the basic stencil part of the cookie. To jazz it up and antique it, I've got a number of different elements. We're going to be talking about royal icing roses and how to age those. We're going to be using some wafer paper bows, some royal icing shards, which I believe are a Julia Usher innovation. At least I haven't seen anybody else do them. We're going to talk about how to make those. And in addition, I'll show you some other wafer paper elements that are optionally used on these cookies, employing craft tools, wafer paper stamps, using these craft paper punches. Of course, you stamp on the wafer paper first using any assortment of stamps, and then punch out with the stamp punch. And then different elements for aging. Got a little bit of gold luster dust, which we're going to extend with alcohol into paint, and some brown petal dust that we're just going to apply straight up without any paint, using a dusting rather than a painting or sponging technique. Let's get started on the basic stenciling part of the project. Okay, so I'm starting by doing the traditional airbrush background on a fully iced and fully dry cookie. Instead of doing the full background as I did on this cookie, I'm going to only airbrush a partial background. We've got a lot of doodads going on top, and I think not having the full background covered will help to balance it a little. This cookie up in front here is an example of a partial background. So I'm just going to cruise through my traditional methods of stenciling with my 5-piece sets. I've got my background down and my mask weighted down with magnets where the message is going to go. And we'll move rather quickly through this process. I'm just going to use brown and an antique blue, which is a custom mix of blue, white, and brown. And remember, when doing close range detailing on stencils, a couple of key technique details. I work at a 90-degree angle to the cookie to prevent underspray. I've got a gentle pullback on the trigger so I don't get too much accumulation of coloring on top of the stencil, which can then seep under. And I apply coloring gradually. So again, 90-degree angle, gentle pullback on the trigger, and at relatively close range, say 1 to 2 inches away from the cookie. Just going to do a light haze here at the top, kind of at the transition point, and a little darker as we get towards the bottom. And I'm not striving for super even coverage because I want this to look somewhat vintage, so a little bit of roughness is fine. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like. One color, and I'm going to come in with some blue highlights after this. You can see how it's partially just sort of shadowed away at the top. That looks pretty good. So as it's stenciled with the brown, it looks pretty monochromatic, of course. I want to jazz it up just a little bit with some free-form airbrushing to give some blue highlights like I did on this cookie in areas like this, this, and this. I'm going to steer clear of the central area I masked off and use my shading stencil for that right after I lay these blue highlights. So I'm spraying at a greater distance because I really just want a shadow and suggestion of color in some of these areas. If I'm too close, it'll be too dark. So now I want to set down my shading stencil because I want to put a little blue highlight around where the message will go. I do need to weight that down with some magnets or other small weights so it doesn't scooch around when I spray. And I'm going to be applying the same blue, and again at a rather large distance, maybe 3 to 4 inches from the cookie, because I just want a light shadowing effect focused around the edge of the rectangle. And lastly, I'm going to come back and apply my message and frame in brown. So I've centered my frame stencil over the shaded area we did last time, and I've weighted it down just like I did the shading stencil. Generally, I like to apply the frame stencil before the message if I'm airbrushing, because it's easier to center the message within the frame if the frame is already in place. But you could do it in either order if you're airbrushing both layers. And again, this is detail work, so I'm operating pretty close range to the cookie with low pressure on the gun and a 90-degree angle to the cookie. Okay, we're on to the last stencil, which is the message stencil. I'm simply centering it within the frame and then weighing it down as always. One thing to note, if you're using royal icing on any layer, it has to be the last layer that you stencil so that the stencils always lie flat against the cookie. In this case, I'm airbrushing, so whether I do the message before the frame or not isn't an issue. This is again close range work to get into those little spaces, so I'll be working with my gun at a 90-degree angle to the cookie, 1 to 2 inches away from the cookie, low pressure on the gun. Ta-da! So that's the traditional method on a fully iced, fully dry cookie. I'm now going to take one that's partially dry, just dry on the surface, gently weight it, and follow the same process, and then press on it afterwards to create a really rustic crackled effect. Okay, I've got my background and mask down on my cookie that's partially dry, and we're just going to proceed through the same stenciling process that we did on the fully dry cookie. So we'll speed this up and go pretty quickly through this process. So there's the big reveal. It looks lovely, but the next thing I want to accomplish is to make it even more antiquated by creating a crackle effect by pressing into the icing. You see how this one here in the background, after I airbrushed it, I created these cracks just by pressing on the icing. Now this cookie had dried about an hour before I did that, just so it was crusted on top but wet underneath. This one's been drying more like 2 hours. So let's see how it works. This is all, the drying time and whether this works is all a matter of ambient humidity conditions in your room. Now you could press directly on the cookie with clean fingers, or once the food coloring is dry, press through plastic. And it's definitely cracking, as you can see. So I'm just going to gently press all over, using my fingerprints to get some kind of dents in it. And that's about as cracked as I want it, I think. I don't want to disrupt the borders too much. Now, if you don't like all the divots, hills, and valleys in it from pressing in it, you could then take your plastic, flop it over, and then just gently press here to kind of flatten out those cracks, if you will. And that takes out some of the hills and valleys. Now, my cracks aren't as nearly as accentuated as they are on this cookie here. You'll see the cracks on the one above look a little bit brown. So what I did was I waited till it was completely dry, and I came back in with a dry brush and dry brown petal dust and dusted just in the cracks. If I were to dust now into the cracks, I'd hit wet icing and I'd get a big blob of brown there, and I want a more delicate touch. So I would set this aside to dry, and I would end up with an effect very similar to this. This, of course, has also been sponged with a little gold luster dust. I think going forward, though, I'm going to work with the traditional cookie and show you now how to put all the embellishments on. Okay, let's talk about how to jazz up this cookie and make it super vintage. I'm going to talk first about wafer paper techniques, and I'm going to show 3 here. Wafer paper bows, which I've shown in other videos, so I'll move through that pretty quickly. A punched wafer paper stamp, and a stamped scroll piece that might go on top of the cookie. Wafer paper, as you may or may not know, is an edible paper composed typically of potato starch, water, a little bit of oil that's been dehydrated into thin edible sheets. It's very translucent. It's very brittle, however, so it doesn't shape well on its own unless you slightly dampen it. You don't want to dampen it too much, however, because it'll begin to dissolve as it's done here in this particular spot on the paper. So to create bows, we're just going to apply water very gingerly to get it to bend. Just another note, wafer paper comes, of course, unprinted, and it also comes printed with food coloring. This is a gorgeous set here, and I'll have the link to it in the video description. But I'm going to make little bows out of this blue paper here. Something similar to this, though this was a white version of the same paper. We're going to make little bow loops that will then cluster into bigger bows. So again, thin slender strip, I cut these on my paper cutter out of this piece. Very brittle. If I were to bend it now, it would just fold. So I'm going to apply a little bit of water to it, and I typically do that with a damp paper towel. And just by running it over the damp paper towel once or twice until it begins to kind of flex on its own. And then I'll form it around my fingers, like so, into little loops. So there we've got 2 together. I kind of busted the one in the back, so let me pull that off. If you want to add to it, that's easy enough to do. Just get another strip, dampen it, and we'll add to the one we already created. And I'll pay a little more attention to what I'm doing. There I've got 2 nicely formed loops, and if the paper is damp enough, I might have to moisten it a little bit. I should be able to just pinch these 2 together to create little loops of 3. And I like to work in clusters of 3 rather than creating a full form bow, because then I have more flexibility about placement later. So let's move that aside and move on to some stamp pieces, for which I use plain wafer paper. And for stamping, I'm stamping with food coloring, of course. So this pad is uninked. It hasn't been used with any other coloring of any type that hasn't been edible, just food coloring. I've used brown coloring on it before, obviously. It's also a foam pad. It's a lot more spongy than a felt pad, which means it absorbs more color. It stays wetter longer, and I can get many more applications of food coloring off of it than off of a felt pad. Felt pads also come uninked, but they're just a little harder to work with. So get a foam pad if you can. I find this is the best way to get a really even application of color. Some people sponge it on their stamps, but I find one big broad application gets the most even color. So I'm applying my food coloring, my liquid gel food coloring, not airbrush coloring, and patting it off. I just want the pad to be moist. And then I'm going to make a little punch stamp. Here's just a stamp I got at the craft food store and sanitized. And I will stamp it onto the end of the paper. Hopefully that'll make good contact. I think so. There are also round ones, but my punch that I have is rectangular, and I think it's going to be better fitting this rectangular shape. This punch squeezes to punch as opposed to pushing down. And there we've got a little stamp piece. I'm going to let that food coloring dry a little bit on top and further age the edges with some different techniques after we do another stamped piece. To make a big scroll, I'm using a big letter stamp. And to stamp it, I like to apply the food coloring this way. It's just easier to see that it's evenly covered. And I am going to stand to kind of get even pressure on this particular stamp as opposed to sitting down. It's just easier for me to be doing that from overhead. There is a rough and a smooth side to wafer paper. Usually I stamp on the smooth side just to get a better imprint, but that's optional. If you want a really rustic look and a less clean imprint, then stamp on the rough side. So I had a pretty faint application of food coloring because I had waited a little while between applying coloring to that and applying it here, or I just simply didn't apply enough here. But I think that's nice. It looks a little bit antiqued and old because it is faded. And I'm not going to have to wait so long for the coloring to dry on top because it's going to dry nearly instantaneously. So we're going to go ahead and make a little scroll. It doesn't have to be quite as big as this, so I've got a lot to work with. But I want to have a deckled edge, so rather than cutting the paper as we did neatly for the bows, I am actually going to tear it using a ruler as a guide. And that'll create kind of a rough little edge, as you can see. And I might just leave it like so. And I'm going to do it a little more carefully on this side so I don't get a big outcropping of extra paper as I did on that side. When I do it more gradually, the tear, rather than pulling it back, I just have a little more control over the tear. Okay, so we'll do these top edges too. As you see, we've got a rectangle now, which could be laid on the cookie as is. It's pretty big. I want to give it some dimension, so we're going to apply, again, a little bit of moisture to it so that it curls, and we'll bend it in various ways, which will add more interest and also allow it to fit that cookie a little bit better. So I've got my damp paper towel again, and I'm just going to run it on the back side. Make sure you don't get moisture on the ink on top or you'll smudge it. Though again, these cookies are very forgiving, so that might not be the end of the world. So it's actually curling on its own just because of the moisture, and I could just let that sit and see what it does. Alternatively, I can try to force some bends in it with the end of a paintbrush. Kind of wrapping it loosely around the paintbrush. It's a little dry here, so I can always reapply if it gets too dry and give it more curve. But I think that's about all I want, and I'm going to just tear it shorter. And so that could be an interesting piece that becomes an accent on the cookie. Not necessarily there, but I think you catch my drift. Let me just quickly show you how to age the edges of either the scroll or the stamp. The process is the same. So as far as those two aging techniques, I'm going to show a sponging technique using Rolcom Super Gold highlighter dust. It's a very, very bright gold. I don't know that it's FDA approved, so if you're very concerned about that, then choose another gold luster dust that is. There are now some on the market that are, so just read your labels carefully. Now to sponge it on and apply it as a paint, I extend it with a little bit of alcohol. I've got vodka in this little squeeze bottle. I don't want much because I want a pretty thick paint. And then I'm just going to mix it together and dab the excess off my brush. You can see how gold that is. And I'm just going to highlight the edges of it with it to create some accents. You could also sponge on top, but I want to see my lettering, so I'm just going to get the edges here. I think that looks kind of cool. It just adds a little glitz and glamour. So I call that sponging. or painting, but I'm using a sponge brush, hence sponging. Now for the other aging method, which I call dusting. I alluded to this earlier. I use a dry brush, dry petal dust or luster dust, and just dust it onto whatever I'm working on. And this creates a much less obvious finish, a much more subtle finish. I'm using cocoa petal dust from CK Products, which I never use. Usually I use a brown luster dust, and I couldn't find it today, so this is going to be an experimentation. It looks a little darker than I'm used to using. So you could age the edges of the stamp by dusting some on the edge itself. I'm actually dusting a little bit on top of the stamp as well, just so you see it. And that creates a more subtle effect, kind of a dirtied effect, if you will. Now, if you were to extend this into a paint with alcohol, you could also do that, and you made your paint very opaque, i.e. used a lot of powder relative to alcohol, you'd have more of an opaque finish here, something less delicate and less translucent. But you can see how that's kind of, hopefully you can see, how that's kind of dirtied up and aged that stamp a little bit. We'll put a little smudge there. So two different aging techniques, dusting and sponging. I've also used the dusting technique to dust the center of my roses, my royal icing roses that are going to go on those cookies. As you can see here, this rose was originally pink. It was dusted in the center brown, and I also sponged the little edges of the petals with gold. So I used both aging techniques on this rose. I'm not going to show you the roses, however, in this video because I cover them extensively in another one, so check that one out. Instead, I'm going to advance to the next technique, which is one I developed specifically for the course where I did this project, and it's called royal icing shards. On to my favorite embellishment, the royal icing shards, and by that I mean these royal icing transfers, if you will, these really rough looking ones that have partial images on them, like the cracked Eiffel Tower and this little partial stamp down here are shards, as are some of these free-form pieces here. And again, remember what I said about this project being forgiving. If you don't get the perfect capture of Paris and it's broken off on one side, that almost is better for this rustic looking cookie. We start by creating a transfer. A royal icing transfer is nothing more than royal icing placed on another surface, dried, and then transferred to a cookie or something else. In this case, I'm going to be doing a large sheet of royal icing so that I can break it up later. And I do like to apply it to acetate as opposed to parchment paper, because as parchment paper dries, it can tend to buckle. Even if you do have it stuck down with shortening, it can tend to buckle and wave. And I want these to be pretty flat so that I can stamp on them later, hence the acetate. And I've also taped it down onto a cardboard just so it has some stability. I also often do this on big cookie sheets, as you'll see. I have some I previously did that are dry. And then I spread royal icing in a thin layer on it. I want an icing that flows gradually off the spoon. This is maybe a thick flooding consistency for me and a very loose outlining consistency. I don't want it running off too much because it'll be super wet and it'll take a long time to dry on acetate. Acetate doesn't breathe as well as parchment paper, so anything placed on acetate will take longer to dry. Typically, I'll do these a week before I need them to make sure they're dry all the way through because we're stamping on them next and the icing needs to be hard. So that's the consistency you're looking for. I might just put a blob down and then spread it as thinly as I can, really. I don't want a big chunk of this on the cookie. I want it to be a relatively delicate, sweet, kind of candy-like piece at the end of the day, but we don't want to see through it. And if there are lots of air bubbles, the best thing to do is just to let your icing sit for a while before you spread it, and some of those air bubbles will be worked out, or just spread over the top a number of times to break up the air bubbles. A few air bubbles in there is not the end of the world because, again, we're going for kind of a rustic look. So the icing, as you can see, is leaving tracks initially, which ultimately settle out, and it settles pretty flat. I might shake it a little bit until it's relatively flat because that'll facilitate the stamping process. Any waves or ridges in there will be an area where the stamp makes more or less contact with the icing and it won't stamp as well. So I think that looks pretty good. I'd set that aside to dry, and again, I said roughly a week ahead. I mean, in some cases, if you've got really dry conditions and it's very thin, not a great depth of icing, it might dry a lot faster, but I don't like to take chances. These can be made way ahead and stored in airtight containers as well. So here are some transfer sheets I did a long time ago. We were actually going to use them in that class that I taught. I did them about 2 or 3 days before the class, and I did spread this relatively thick, meaning to quite some depth. After 3 days, it still wasn't dry underneath. This is what I mean about royal icing taking a long time to dry on acetate. So my first student attempted to stamp the Eiffel Tower and took out much of the icing. We then put the sheet in a dehydrator for a couple of hours, and it was ready to stamp on. You want it to be dry all the way through. So that's what happens if it's too wet. This is what happens if you've let it dry properly. You can stamp without cracking the underlying piece. I'm going to move this blue one down. It's closer to the color I used over here, and I think I'm going to use a blue shard on my white cookie, just for contrast, and just show you the stamping process. This is just like I would stamp on wafer paper, like we just did, or on an actual cookie. I like to do that while the acetate is still on the support board. In this case, it's a cutting board before I had a cardboard. That just gives it more stability and makes the icing underneath less likely to crack. If it cracks, it's okay, but I'd rather purposely crack it how I want it on the cookie if I can. So I'm just going to do a big Eiffel Tower, or actually I could do this Paris stamp, which I quite like. Let's start with that. Then I'll have a couple of options to choose from. Again, this is a pretty big stamp, so I usually actually apply the coloring upside down so I can make sure there's even coverage without having to flip it over all the time and look at the stamp. So I think that looks pretty good. And I'm going to place it at some distance from the other one so that in the process of breaking up this icing, I don't break both images. So pressing pretty hard, and you can hear that the underlying icing sheet isn't cracking under all this pressure, but I'm pressing pretty hard because I want to make sure I get good contact everywhere. And that looks pretty good. So that's the basic inking and stamping process, and now I am just going to start the removal of some of these pieces by taking off this acetate sheet. I'm going to start with the easy one, this little stamp in the corner, and see if I can't break up around that. So wherever you want to break, if you don't want to break into what you stamped, I suggest applying pressure in a focal way with your fingers. So here I'm going to do my first break between Paris and the stamp so that I didn't break into the stamp, and then as I want to take pieces off, whoops, I just cracked that in half. As much as I tried to apply focal pressure, I did break that one in half. Not the end of the world. These little pieces I would save because they might look cute tucked in and around a bigger, more complete piece. So let's see if I can do a better job of breaking off this little Eiffel Tower here. I'm going to break way in. I might even save pieces like this. These are great pieces, and I use this similar technique to make slate in my arbor video. If you haven't seen that, I recommend go checking it out. So I broke up a bunch of pieces. I think I found some I can piece together quite nicely. We're going to now move on to the final assembly process and put all these beautiful embellishments together. So this is the fun part, which is seeing how everything comes together into the final creation. I'm going to start my cookie by putting a delicate little border on it, tiny little dots. For that, I use a relatively loose icing of beadwork consistency. I'm going to do tiny dots this time. Just because I have so much going on top, I don't really want the border to interfere with the other elements. And when these dry, I can also sponge them with a little bit of the gold luster dust and create some highlights along the border, which might be interesting. Now we're going to start applying the various dimensional elements, and for that I use a thick royal icing glue. I'm going to use white so that if any smudges out from underneath my elements, it's going to be easier to clean off. And generally, as I said it in this video, perhaps, if not in many other videos, I like to start by placing my big anchor pieces first and then fine-tuning with the smaller details. But I am going to do a test run here. Originally, I thought a white shard might look better against this because I ended up with a lot of blue on the edge. And contrast-wise, it does look pretty good. But this particular piece, which is the only one I have here on set, is just a little too big, and I hesitate to break it and ruin the image that's already there because I might be able to use that on something else. So I think I am going to use the Paris element that I did break in half. But by piecing it together, I think it looks kind of cool. And it's much smaller. I can get it off to the side so it hangs off the cookie a little bit, but still displays my message. In fact, I think I'm going to inch it down here and anchor the rose about there. and just start gluing. And now no rose is complete without some leaves. I'd like to fill in around some of the gaps that I created with these dimensional pieces with them as well. And so we're going to be filling in with a little bit of thick, light green royal icing using a number 349 or number 350 tip. You could even go bigger to 352 because we've got a pretty big rose. So here I'm doing a variegated leaf, meaning I'm pushing forward to create pressure and then pushing forward, pulling back, pushing forward, pulling back, pushing forward, pulling back to create kind of ridges as opposed to just pushing forward and pulling back. So you see the difference? I think that's it. I'm going to leave the top pretty clear. I've got an abundance of stuff going down at the bottom, which sort of anchors the cookie, and I don't think it needs anything more. Again, a combination of my beautiful Prettier Plaques Bon Voyage set and a number of vintage elements. Royal icing shards, wafer paper stamps, royal icing roses, and wafer paper ribbons. We've got the traditional application of my stencil to an already iced and dried cookie. You can also go super vintage, as a reminder, and crack that background, as I showed earlier in the video, and also age it with other techniques such as dusting and sponging. Whether you replicate this cookie in its entirety or choose to apply these techniques to some other cookie, it's up to you, but I hope you've learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Live sweetly!